Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. I would like to say a special word of thanks to Sullivan High School for hosting this conversation. In their lovely but sweltering auditorium, which is a good indication that we've got some funding issues, and an old boiler. I'd also like to thank all of the volunteers who helped make this evening possible. I am Megan Cusick. I'm a member of Network 49's Education Committee, and we have been talking about funding and education for quite some time. And one of the things that we decided as a funding subcommittee was that we really needed to have a broader conversation, both to educate ourselves and to engage our neighbors in a conversation about what the real funding issues are, who's responsible for what elements of funding from the state level to the district down to the local schools, so that we could really begin to hold people accountable for the areas of their responsibility and try to affect systemic change. We know that the schools in Rogers Park are doing some amazing work, but we also know that they face a number of challenges and have experienced a number of funding cuts that were accelerated in the past several years. And we believe that the funding issues are significant but solvable, and that's why we are excited to bring together a panel of people, a panel of experts who can help us figure out how to frame questions and demands of our elected officials so that we can really move forward and affect long-term change. Before we start, I want to say a word about Network 49. It is a progressive, community-led political organization committed to organizing and advocating for policies and elected leadership that advance a high quality of community life, benefiting all residents in the 49th Ward of the City of Chicago, and focusing on areas such as housing, community safety, balanced development, and of course, education. So as I said, we are very pleased to be joined by a panel of experts this evening, and I will briefly introduce all three of them, and then I will hand it over to them for some presentations, and then what we'll do is have a question and answer session. So you should have received some note cards when you signed in. As questions come up, and they undoubtedly will during the presentations and during the evening, please jot those questions down, and we have some room hosts who can pick those up for you. So just hold up your hand in between presenters and we will pick those up from you. Can our room hosts stand up so people know who you are? So great. So just raise a card if you have a question and they'll be happy to pick it up for you. One other bit of housekeeping. As I said, we are grateful to Sullivan for hosting us this evening. We will be wrapping up promptly at 8:30, and in order to allow the folks who have been here all day to start to make their way home, we would appreciate your help in moving out and moving towards the exits in the building when we close down. We will have some information for you, some flyers on the way out. Be sure to pick those up when you pass by the table that you signed in on. And thanks for coming. So tonight we are joined by three people who have both long-standing and very unique views of education funding on different levels, and by that I mean at the state level, the district level, and the local school level. We are very pleased, is that better? Thank you. To be joined by Ralph Martire, who's the Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. If you have never heard him talk about school funding in Illinois before, you are in for an evening of amazing enlightenment. I first heard him speak about 15 years ago, and although the problems were framed slightly differently, I'm thrilled that he is helping people still understand how funding works in Illinois. We're also happy, and I should also say he has just arrived from Springfield, so we're particularly grateful that he made the trip here instead of home. We're also pleased to be joined by Jenny Biggs, who is the Communications Director for Raise Your Hand. As many of you know, Raise Your Hand has been one of the premier voices in parent advocacy in Chicago. They have also done an amazing job of analyzing the district budget within hours of its release, which is always amazingly impressive. But they have been a real source of inspiration both in their activism and also their analysis. So we are appreciative of having you take the time to join us as well. And finally, we are joined by Joanna Sue. We are grateful to have her join us as a representative of Gale Community Academy. Joanna has been on the local school council there for years, first as a community member and now as a parent. And she has seen the school level budget evolve over years, and also seen firsthand the real impact of the shift from central budgeting to school-based budgeting or student-based budgeting. So we are grateful to have her firsthand view of how education funding has impacted a school within our own community. So with that, I will hand it over to Ralph Martire. As I said, please do write down those questions and pass them over to us when you have them ready.
Hi, good evening. I'm Ralph Martire. I'm Executive Director of the Bipartisan Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. We're not technically nonpartisan, we're bipartisan. That means my board of directors actually doesn't like or trust each other at all, and it's fantastic for us, the staff, because it lets us focus on best practices and data. So things have changed in Illinois in a very big way. I mean, when we all went to bed on August 30th, really, we went to bed in the state that actually had the worst school funding formula in America. And by worst, I mean the one that was the least equitable by every objective standard, and one that woefully inadequately funded K-12 education. By the time we went to bed the following evening, we went to bed in the state that had the best formula. That's not funded yet, but the actual formula that we have is going to work if we fund it by definition equitably, and it's going to ensure that every school district across the state has adequate resources to meet the needs of the kids it educates. So what changed? We used to be, like 36 other states, a foundation formula state, right? Where the state of Illinois would peg a foundation level amount of school funding per kid, and that would be the amount per kid statewide, and then some combination of state and local resources funded it. Our foundation level was based on nothing, not one actual objective cost of educating children. Not surprisingly, nothing is not the strongest predicate for education funding. So in the late 90s, Governor Edgar said, hey, I want to have an idea of what we should have this foundation level pegged to. So he appointed EFAB, the Education Funding Advisory Board. They made a recommendation for what that foundation level should be based on the cost of a very specific educational standard. What would it cost per kid to buy an education of sufficient quality to get 2/3 of the non-at-risk children passing our state's test? That was our old aspiration. Think about that as an aspiration. It's 2/3 of the non-at-risk kids, so it throws 1/3 of them out the window. Apparently we don't care if they can pass tests. And it doesn't count any at-risk kids. So, you know, at-risk, term of art in education policy, means at risk of academic failure. 3 children hit that when they walk in the door: low income, special needs, and English language learners. So apparently Illinois, up until the evidence-based model, didn't aspire to educate its at-risk kids. Even though that was a pretty tight, narrow standard, right, only getting to 2/3 of the children in the state who have a reasonable likelihood of academic success passing the state's test, we never funded it. In fact, in 2017, last fiscal year, our state school funding in total was $4 billion less than what EFAB suggested. $4 billion. That's amazing. When the evidence-based model passed, it completely changed this foundation approach. No longer now going forward will the state set some capricious, arbitrary number of per kid funding. Instead, the model identifies the resources, financial resources, every individual district in the state of Illinois needs based on its unique student population to implement those evidence-based practices which over time have demonstrated they actually enhance student achievement, and across the board. So not just on test scores, they increase graduation rates, they reduce dropout rates, they increase college attendance rates, they increase college graduation rates. In other words, all those metrics that you really want, those outcome metrics you really want from a K-12 system, the evidence-based model funds. So there are 27 of these research or evidence-based elements built right into the statute. The State Board of Education has read it to be 34 elements, whatever. There's 27, but if ISBE wants to call it 34 for their ease, let's call it 34. And these practices include a lot of things that just make common sense, right? So it's smaller class size for K through 3. Of course you need a smaller class size for K through 3. It funds that. It funds high quality teachers. It funds high quality tier 2 interventionalists. It funds after hours programs. It funds programs that are enrichment in nature, but we all know have a statistically meaningful correlation to enhancing student achievement. So let me give you an idea of how it works. Say you're in, I'm going to pick on a middle school district because I know those the best. I'm the president of a school board that's a elementary and middle school district. So say you have a middle school. Under the evidence-based model, it says, all right, for every 142 kids enrolled in your middle school, there's the first big change from the old formula, by the way. It's based on enrollment, not ADA. You have to create your school budget based on the number of kids enrolled to attend, not the number of kids who actually bother to show up, by the way. So it's a nice positive change there. But for every 142 children enrolled in your school, the evidence-based model says you need 1 full-time equivalent teacher for every core subject. So it funds that. Then it says for every 125 low-income children, you need another full-time equivalent teacher in every core subject. And that low-income child counts twice, once in your general enrollment and once again as a low-income kid. For every 125 English language learners, you need another full-time equivalent teacher in every core subject. And if that EL kid happens to be low income, that child counts 3 times. So you can see what the formula does. It takes these evidence-based practices, class size, interventionalists, professional development, nurses, guidance counselors, psychologists, based on your school district's unique student population, including its demographics. It says, here's the resources this district will need to implement these 27 evidence-based practices so that over time the children attending that district have a reasonable likelihood of academic success. They certainly will have the type of educational opportunity that will allow them to succeed as opposed to what we did in the past. So that's a big change. So every school district gets a unique, what's called adequacy target, the amount of resources it needs. That's the first part of the formula. Now, we don't have it fully funded. This may surprise no one. But when the State Board of Education ran the numbers, what they found was, based on the evidence, today school funding levels in Illinois are $7.4 billion short of what the evidence indicates is needed. And to ISBE's great credit, by the way, they requested that level of an increase for this coming year. They said, state, now that we know, let's put the money in, right? I thought that was a very rational thing to do. A number of commentators have slammed them for asking for this huge increase in school funding. It literally doubles what the state puts in. But the bottom line is it's the most rational request they could make. It's based entirely on the research and the evidence of what works. And since we know that, shouldn't we fund it? Interesting thing. We're not gonna, not right away anyway. So they are going to put $350 million in new funding into the evidence-based model this year, and it looks like they're talking about putting a similar amount of new money in next year. So this is the only money, this $350 million, that is going to be distributed through the evidence-based model. How do you make sure that distribution goes to the schools that need it most? And what do you do about prior funding that school districts received? Well, the prior funding part we took care of was something called the base funding minimum. We changed over to the evidence-based model this year, fiscal year 2018. The base funding minimum for every school district in Illinois was what they received in state grants in 2017, all state grants. Now, this is going to create a little bit of a challenge for people tracking expenses, because included within that, right, are things like some old categorical funding for special education. That's still special education money. You still have to use that at the school district level for special education purposes. You still have to account for that. But that resource is wrapped into your base funding minimum so that the state can't take it away. What that really did was made it absolutely ironclad that shifting from our old flawed foundation formula to this new evidence-based model would not create winner and loser school districts. Because the printout politics of that would kill any education funding reform, right? Because legislators don't ask, is it a good policy proposal? They go, how does my school district do? And if their school district loses money, they are a no vote, no matter how good the legislation is. This took all that silly nonsense off the board. Plus, if you think about it, in a state that is $7.4 billion short of adequate as its starting point, let's not take resources away from schools, pre-existing resources. So that's the base funding minimum. The second part of what's expected to go into K-12 funding is some local resources. Now, this is not a surprise to everyone. Illinois is currently the most reliant state on local resources to fund K-12 education. We rely more on property taxes than any other state in America. However, you do have to have property taxes form a portion of your school funding. What the evidence-based model does for this element, it's called the local capacity target, is it looks at the EAV of every school district in the state of Illinois, and it puts them on a continuum. Based on where you are in the continuum, you're expected to put in a certain amount of school funding. So those school districts with very high levels of EAV are expected to put in a lot. Where I live, River Forest, we are expected to put in a lot. And communities in, let's say, East St. Louis, Marion, they're expected to put in significantly less because they have lower EAVs. That's the second element. So when you add those two elements together, your base funding minimum, what you got from the state, and your local capacity, what you rationally should be expected to put into school funding, that creates a dollar amount of current resources available between your local resources and what the state gave you last year to fund education. We divide that dollar amount by your adequacy target, the amount you should have, to see how close to adequate you are. Do you have 70% of the resources you need, 80, 90, 60? And based on that, this percentage of adequacy, every school district in the state of Illinois was put into one of four tiers. Tier 1 school districts are furthest away from adequacy. They have 64% of the resources the evidence indicates they need or less. Tier 2 school districts have between 64 and 90% of the resources. Tier 3, between 90 and 100. Tier 4, Tawny Little River Forest, 100% or more. So the new money now, the $350 million, is going to be distributed among these tiers as follows. Half of it goes to Tier 1. Half. $175 million of the $350 million goes to those districts that are furthest away from adequacy. The next 49% of the new money goes to Tier 1 and Tier 2 pro rata. So Tier 1 gets another bite at the apple. So now 99% of this new money have gone to districts that are below 90% of adequate. 0.9% of the new money goes to those districts between 90 and 100% funded, and 0.1% of the new money goes to the river forests of the world. Now, why is the cutoff 90% of adequacy for, really not getting much new money at all, as opposed to 100%? And the answer is simple. The model is only considering state and local resources available to a school district. It is not looking at federal. Federal's not in the formula. So the federal government funds anywhere between 8 and 11% of the cost of education every year. So if you're at 90% of what the evidence indicates you need in your resources between your state and local mix, you're pretty close to 100%. And we really wanted to focus the distribution of new resources as they go into the formula on those districts furthest away from adequacy to bring them up most rapidly, okay? So that is how the formula is designed and how it will work. Another interesting thing we did, that base funding minimum is not tied to 2017. It moves up every year. So whatever you get from the state of Illinois in the first year of the evidence-based model gets added into your old base funding minimum and becomes your new base funding minimum in 2019. We built in a fail-safe to stop the state from cutting pre-existing funding levels to schools. Those are the basic elements of the model. As you can tell, it's a very different approach to school funding than we've ever had before. Now, if you're curious about CPS, in the initial runs, and I haven't seen the final runs, I don't know if you've seen the final runs for CPS under the EBM, it was about $2.3 billion below adequate, just CPS. So CPS needs some resources to have an adequate amount of financial capacity to implement all these evidence-based practices for every school, and that's clear. You may have heard that the legislation constituted a bailout of the city of Chicago, and really, that rhetoric was not only inaccurate, I would say it was veiled racism, honestly. And it was used as politics to play mostly white and conservative areas of the state of Illinois against the city of Chicago. And frankly, against their own economic interests if they were low to middle income communities. And the reason I say that is we've actually looked at how the numbers were intended to go. Now, like I say, I haven't seen the final, so there'll be some minor adjustments. And CPS ends up getting roughly 20% of the new money under the distribution in the new formula, that evidence-based 350. They get about 70 million. They have 20% of the kids. Where's the disproportionate share going to CPS? I'm not seeing it. When you compare CPS's poverty profile and the number of kids they educate, so educates are about 367,000 kids attend CPS schools, and the poverty profile is roughly, the low income counts roughly 85% of those children are low income. And you compare that to lumping together other school districts across the state that as a combination educate over 300,000 kids, and you look at their percentage of poverty, you find something very interesting. CPS ends up getting the same amount as school districts across the state that educate roughly 320,000 kids, so less than CPS, but have a poverty profile somewhere between 45 and 60% low income. So they have less concentration of poverty and fewer kids, but they get the same amount of money as CPS. Why would that be? The local capacity target. CPS, unlike other communities for the most part that have high concentrations of low-income children, has high EAV. It is expected to contribute some money in to the formula, and it should be. It's a rational thing to do when you're creating a statewide funding formula. But CPS's unique concerns, and particularly its unique concerns with its pension, were very well accounted for in the new formula. So the first thing it did, and this isn't news to anyone in the room, I don't think, is for the first time, the state's actually going to pay the normal cost contribution to the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund. That's $220 million. So $220 million CPS used to have to take out of its property taxes to fund that pension contribution, just the normal cost part. It no longer has to. So think about that another way, that frees up $220 million CPS already has in its base funding minimum to use not for its old pension cost, but to put in the classroom. That's over and above this $70 million that's coming in. That's a nice addition. Now, it's not just normal cost, that is the cost of funding the benefit, that's the pension cost in CPS. I mean, as you all know, the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund, or I think you all know, was 100% funded in the year 2000. And then Mayor Daley and CPS decided to put $0 in for a decade. That creates an unfunded liability. You do it long enough, and 10 years is really pretty much long enough. So now the systems are just about 54% funded, meaning there's a huge legacy cost, an unfunded liability that has to be paid in addition to the normal cost. If the only issue with the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund was covering the normal cost, first of all, it's a very low normal cost, and it's very easily covered in extant resources. The add-on charge to CPS for engaging in this irresponsible fiscal practice for a decade this year is going to be roughly $490 million. So let's call it $500 million just to use a round number, okay? What the model does is it says, look, that $500 million you have to pay, there's no way out of it, and the only place you're going to be able to pay it from CPS is your property taxes. So that $500 million reduces CPS's local capacity target. We understand CPS can't spend the same tax dollar twice, once to pay its pension obligation and once to educate its children. So what we tried to do was create a funding formula that, I don't know, crazily enough reflected reality. So we tried to isolate only the property, wealth, resources CPS actually had available to it to fund the classroom. So that's a long and short way of saying the new formula, by design, will be equitable in distribution and adequate in amount. We just got to get it funded. So the challenges in a state like Illinois are generating adequate state-based resources to get the state to kick in this $7 billion, you know, sooner rather than later. And really, you wouldn't want to put it all in 1 year. So though ISB did make that request, if you think about it, a system can only rationally absorb so much of a new investment up front. It needs some time to plan for it. You have to do hiring. You have to do a facilities analysis, right? You have to deal with labor markets and availability and pipelines and all that stuff. So a better approach is actually phasing in that $7 billion, fully inflation adjusted, over a 3 to 5 year period. And probably 5 is better because it's a substantial amount of new money each year, and districts can plan thoughtfully over a 5-year cycle to take that money and incorporate it and use it. But we don't have it. I mean, the state of Illinois right now, in reality, has a deficit of north of $16 billion in a general fund that only spends about $27 billion on services. So that's a challenge. Now, they did borrow $6 billion to pay some of that backlog in bills, so the accumulated deficit will only look like it's $10 billion. It's actually the 6. So the state needs to raise some new resources, but I think it's really going to be an easier political path to put pressure on the General Assembly and whomever the governor is to raise those resources now that we've passed the evidence-based model. Because we can say something now as advocates for education we could never say before. We know what it costs to educate our children, and you're not putting it in. This isn't about the poor, starving kids. This is about what the research says is needed to fund an educational system that meets the educational needs of the children it serves. And by meeting their needs, we're saying putting in those practices that have been shown to improve student achievement over time. Isn't that what you want out of an education system? So I don't want to hear the education governor or the education legislator or the education anything unless you're willing to talk about raising the revenue we need to fund our schools to what the evidence indicates is required. Different argument, isn't it? The second thing that's really neat about the evidence-based model, we were having a little sidebar about this, but it creates an advocacy tool for parents and stakeholders. Why do I say that? The statute lays out what the evidence-based practices are. You can now look at how your school district is spending its resources and see if it's allocating them the way the research indicates actually enhances student achievement. And you know, it might be a challenge, given contracts and everything else, to move around base funding minimum, the old money, into these new evidence-based categories, right? But as the new money comes in, I want, at least my school district is talking about, how do we apply our money to maximize the effect size, what the research indicates works to move student achievement. You now know that. We know the effect size for these practices. Some of the most powerful things school districts can do with money, because you can't put all these things in place at once. The state's not funding the full evidence-based model. You have to pick and choose. Low cost, high outcomes come from high-end, embedded, evidence-based professional development for your teachers, tier 2 interventionalists. Let's get them on board. Let's start there. That's a way to build the capacity of the system. But anyway, it's a very radical change, the evidence-based model, and how we fund education, but it's a really, really good one. It's literally the best practice now any state has on its books. And it's up to us as advocates to make sure it gets funded. Thank you.
Maybe I can't move that. Hi, everyone. My name is Jenny Biggs. I am a CPS mom of 3. Before I was a mom, I was a high school science teacher in the south suburbs. And now I am the communications director for Raise Your Hand, which is a citywide parents organization. We advocate for high quality education for every child, and it's a lot of work. Thank you. Raise Your Hand started in 2010. I actually dug up a cool picture on our Facebook page from the first rally/press conference on April 22nd, 2010. These children are now 8 years older than they are in the picture, so a bunch of parents were really gushing on Facebook about it. But in 2010, the state threatened to cut $1.3 billion from education in Illinois. And CPS then threatened to increase class sizes to 37. And it obviously set off alarms in every parent's head, and I'm sure every educator's head as well. And parents basically became mobilized around this, like, how can we stop this from happening? And also on top of all of this, CPS was running a deficit. So we had both the state and the city, which seems to be a common theme in our work, because we have two different levers we're always trying to push to try to get more funding from both sources. Oh, we also push on CPS as well, but we'll get to that a little bit later. But Raise Your Hand was able to mobilize parents across the city to send 20,000 emails to legislators, which is pretty remarkable. It was just an online petition, and that stopped these budget cuts that Illinois was threatening. And also at the local level, Raise Your Hand conducted the first ever TIF surplus campaign. And actually, Mayor Daley released $90 million to CPS with that campaign. Yay, and then the budget cuts got started. So our work was cut out for us at this point. In 2010, the state and CPS agreed on a pension holiday, which Ralph mentioned, and there were no real revenue solutions found, or maybe it's better to say enacted. They were not enacted, any revenue solutions. And we trudged along for 7 years while CPS made budget cut after budget cut to our schools. Budget cuts, that when we say budget cuts, the big ones mainly happened between 2013 and 2017. Over on my slide here, I have in 2016, we had a $1 billion bake sale down at the Thompson Center. Probably about 100 plus parents showed up, some with baked goods, myself, and you know, we got a lot of press. We marched around. We had cool pictures selling crookies, and I think I had Tiff's Ahoy cookies. And you know, we were all mad because our schools were getting budget cuts, but it was a way to bring attention to the issue. And we had parents actively making phone calls while out there. We weren't just out there yelling. We had people making phone calls with these scripts, and you see we were hitting the mayor, the governor, and Speaker Mike Madigan. Thank you, Megan. Meanwhile, while all these budget cuts were happening, there were other things happening which were impacting our budgets. New schools, deficits, and SBB, otherwise known as student-based budgeting or per-pupil budgeting. So CPS, as you know, closed dozens of schools. If you don't know, CPS has also opened dozens of schools during that same time. Student enrollment has been declining. I was trying to find some numbers last night, and I found that in the past 2 years, we've lost 21,000 students. CPS was running deficits every year between 2013 and 2017 in the amounts of $400 million to $1 billion, depending on the year and depending on what the talking point was at that time, it seemed, in some cases. Student-based budgeting, it also began during this time. It's also known as per-pupil budgeting. Basically, there's a dollar amount placed on every child that is enrolled at your school at the 20th day, right? The 20th day that's your enrollment, that's your student-based budgeting. For all you LSC people out there or people who are going to run for LSC, in your local school budget, that's line 115. What student-based budgeting did was it definitely decreased the amount of money our schools received, but it also placed the emphasis on things that were being cut. Well, that was a school's decision. That was a local decision. You were given the money. You, at the principal and LSC level, you decide how to spend it. So you cut that program? Not me, says CPS. That's you, the school, deciding that. So it really, that's when you started to hear that kind of language, and it was kind of designed that way. And yeah, that's what we still have and are still dealing with today. Yeah, I think I'm done with this one. Oh yeah, I forgot about this one. This is a pretty cool slide. Oh, that's okay. The SBB vicious cycle. Here's how student-based budgeting has been impacting our schools. We'll start up here at the upper left, falling enrollment. So if your enrollment is down, which it could very likely be because we've lost so many students in Chicago, that's going to reduce your SBB funding because you are only getting dollar amounts for each student. What happens when you have less money? You're going to have less programming, you're going to have less teachers, you're going to have just less of everything. What happens come the next school year? You might lose more students because, well, the enrollment is declining, but also a parent might be like, you don't have art? Oh, I can go somewhere else and look for art. And then you have more reduced student-based budgeting, and then you lose more programs and staff. So it's kind of this vicious cycle. Now, please also keep in mind, this is not the only funding that CPS has, but this is a big portion of the funding that LSCs receive, and this is what they have to deal with when they get their budgets. And we can see how this can be a very vicious cycle in harming schools long-term. And district schools continue to get cut. We've analyzed budgets, and we have found that in the last 5 years, district schools have lost $400 million. In the same time period, charter budgets have increased by $290 million, and the district now spends about $668 million on charters. CPS in the past 2 years has made mid-year cuts. So I think it was like February of a couple of years in a row. 1 year they reduced the student-based budgeting amount mid-year. And then they've also done things like frozen discretionary funds. And that obviously harms schools and harms them mid-year, which can also have other effects like loss of staff, loss of programming, et cetera. CPS has reduced the SBB amount over time as well, and that has caused, obviously, another budget cut in kind of a sneaky way. So the bottom line, the last bullet point, is CPS has reduced per pupil funding over time while opening dozens of charter schools, even as enrollment has dropped, draining resources from district schools. This is an infographic that we put together in 2016. We have many parent volunteers that apparently love to get into the budget books and try to decipher it all, which is really valuable because parents come to us from individual schools telling us about losses of programming or staff, and CPS tends not to believe anyone. But if we can collectively put it together, sometimes there's a force there. And also it could alert other parents to try to go into a school and find out what's happening. Maybe they're not that in tune, but then they're like, hey, I saw that librarians are gone. Do we still have a librarian? So this was from 2016. There's 500 district-run schools in CPS. At the time, there were 157 librarians. The CTU just put out some data in September, and they say that now there's 139 librarians. 252 elementary school music teachers, 298 elementary school arts teachers, 265 guidance counselors, 376 health service positions. I kind of imagine it could be even lower now because, like I said, this is from 2016, but it gives you an idea of the cuts in relation to how many schools there actually are, and you can kind of think about how that impacts schools. My son's school, I had to go up there one day to see the nurse, and the nurse told me he is in 3 schools, and that's pretty common. And so my son happened to be injured on a day the nurse was there, which was nice, but you know, that obviously doesn't happen every day. Clinicians, this is an infographic we put together in 2017 about wraparound services. You can see some numbers here are really troubling, and we also have some ratios up there as well. Full-time school nurses, 302. I'm going to guess that that's down because I know that there's a nursing shortage period in CPS, and I think they're struggling to get nurses in anyway. 4 crisis interventionists in the entire district. We live in Chicago. I mean, that is just like, that's like a punch in the gut. Along with all of this that I just mentioned, also keep in mind, and if you're a parent, you know this, in conjunction with all of these cuts, school fees are up. They're way up because schools have to find the money somewhere to get supplies and other programming. Also fundraising and the ability to do it or not is causing greater inequity across the system. Some schools can raise a few $10,000, $20,000. Some can raise $200,000. Some can just raise $500. That's causing inequity across the system as well as all of these funding difficulties. So the new Illinois school funding bill, we have some lots of good. I think Ralph probably covered all of this. He did, but there's also some problems, and I think Ralph covered most of this as well. It needs $6 billion. You said $6 billion, right? Or did you say 7? 7.4. I did write that down because I thought, wait, I thought it was 6. Oh man, $7.4 billion. Tax credit compromise, we believe, drives a wedge for more privatization, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Also, the new funding formula, as well as the tax credit scholarships, it also diverted more money into charter schools, and we've calculated that it's about $37 million from CPS district schools into CPS charter schools. Tax credit scholarships, otherwise known as NEO vouchers. We are against these strongly, and we tried to get ahead of this because we saw maybe it was coming, and then it wound up coming into this new funding formula. They allow donors to direct their tax dollars to specific private schools and allows corporations to direct their tax dollars to broader support of private education. We're big believers in public funds should support the public good, which is in fact public education. Tax credit programs have been shown in other states to actually grow over the years. So once the door opens to them, they tend to get larger in scope and in size. And we are seeing a little bit of that in the legislature. There are a couple of bills right now. We have them itemized up here. They allow a reduction of requirements for private institutions to receive the tax credit scholarship money, and there's also another bill that allows donations to reduce evidence-based funding by donated amounts. So legislators are already trying to play with this a little bit and widen it, so we have some great concerns over that. My next slide is quick. I'm not going to get into tax credit scholarships. We do have a fact sheet on our website, so I would direct you, if you're curious about what they are, to go read this, because it's not very easy to understand. And also, you know, Google it and read some more about it. And it's worth getting to know because it's going to impact our budgets. Will the state actually meet the commitment to fund schools at the new levels if it's not mandated? Like we said, they need $7.4 billion. Rauner, it looks like he has committed $350 million in his budget, which Ralph mentioned. In his budget, though, Rauner did advocate for rolling back the state paying for the CPS normal costs of the pension. So that's something we need to watch, because that would, I guess that would cost us about $300 million if that happens, right?
This year it'll be $228 billion.
Okay. 228 million this year. So that's something that we need to watch. We also think there might be some concerns. There's more evidence that legislators are concerned that they're not actually going to find this money. And there's a bill written by Senator Bertino Tarrant, and in her bill, which actually passed a committee a few weeks ago, this bill would force legislators to appropriate the minimum funding levels before any dollars go to the tax credit scholarships. So that's kind of indicating, like, I don't know that we're going to fully fund this, but let's try to protect what we have. We've been saying since Raise Your Hand started that we need revenue. This is an infographic from 2015. We stand by many of these things still, but some we've probably walked away from. But there's many long-term solutions like progressive income tax, closing corporate loopholes. There's also short-term solutions like TIF surplus. If you notice on the infographic, again, we are always advocating at the state level, and we advocate at the city level. Also in this infographic, and every month at the Board of Education, we are also questioning a lot of the expenditures that CPS has and contracts they commit to. So departments they have that seem to be huge and growing, we really try to get them to focus on teaching and learning in the classroom, and the rest of the stuff we do try to question, and we go and we try. And here's my slide about CPS can cut spending. So more money is invested in teaching and learning. That's an actual suggestion box outside of the CEO's office, by the way. It's kind of cute. I assume like a high school probably made it in a woodworking class, but I was like, I'm going to put that up there. So they do take suggestions. So we are at the Board of Ed meeting every month. They could cut non-essential contracts. They say they cut central office, but I think I was looking this up tonight. Cranes had an article about how that's kind of not really true. So did Catalyst Chicago back when Catalyst was in business, or when it was Catalyst. It's still this Chicago Reporter, I guess, took them over. We were at the board meeting last month because CEO Jackson said that she was going to get rid of all of the Claypool crony contracts, but we haven't seen any evidence of that yet, so we asked, did you do it? Where's the evidence? I don't think we got an answer on that exactly. And that person followed up with Board of Ed office hours too, asking about specific contracts and if they had been examined completely. Also, stopping charter expansion and selective enrollment expansion. I would also add that we're big advocates of CPS coming up with a citywide, comprehensive, community-led facilities plan that's transparent so that we know what schools are going to get a new roof or an addition, or maybe their enrollment is down and we need to talk about how a community can, what they can do to get kids in their schools, strengthen their schools, etc. I was hoping not to cover pensions very much. This is our pension slide. I think Ralph covered it. Yeah, he did. So I'm going to say, and we're going to skip that too. This is just a little chart we made to demonstrate how over the years the debt service has also gone up, as well as the pension cost. And I think I just have maybe one more slide. What can we do? We can organize. Local school councils are the only democratic body in CPS, and you can run for local school council. Paperwork is due on Friday. Build a parent community network. Start talking to parents and share knowledge about what's going on, share contact information, write letters to your elected officials, share our fact sheets or any information we share. We do send out an email blast. You can sign up for those on our website. Visit your elected officials, bring a friend, talk to them about how budget cuts impact your children. Give examples of, the lack of music instruction, how you don't have a playground, how, the ceiling is crumbling on your kids. Whatever it is, they need to hear that. They're the ultimate decision makers, and like Ralph said, this new formula could actually be used as an advocacy tool if we really understand it and use it. And that's about all I have to say, so thank you very much.
Okay. First of all, can you hear me? I have a very small voice, so I never know if people can hear me or not. Good. All right. No? All right. Well, thank you very much to Megan and everyone for inviting me to be part of this distinguished panel tonight. I was first elected to the LSC as a community rep, as Megan said, back in 2012. My daughter was just 2 years old, and so this is now her third year at Gale, and I'm a parent representative and the chair of the LSC. So I'll be speaking briefly about the impact of funding cuts over the years on Gale and how we've been trying to make up the difference. Next. Great. So at a glance, here are some of the current stats for our students. About 60% are Black, and I should correct this slide a little bit, as our Black student population includes not only African Americans, but also recent African refugees and immigrants. Also, about 30% of our students are Latinx, 7% Asian, and 3% other, and that includes multiracial and Arab Americans. 97% are low income, 21% diverse learners, 32%, about a third, have limited English proficiency, and at Gale, about at least 19 languages are spoken, with the largest language groups being Spanish, Yoruba, Arabic, Nepali, Burmese, and Kinyarwanda. Very similar, I think, to probably the demographics here at Sullivan. We have a 43% mobility rate, very high, and we are a level 2 school, so intensive supports. So I've been on the LC since 2012, and during that time we've lost about $1.5 million. And so what has been the impact of that? Okay. With the steady loss of funding, we've lost critical positions that, like Jenny had talked about. For example, when our librarian retired and our technology teacher moved, those positions could not be replaced. So we have 2 libraries in our building that are not being utilized, and though I believe we have a Chromebook for every student, we're not totally able to ensure that every student is able to use that technology to their greatest capacity. Along with the decline in funding, back in 2012, Gale was also on the initial school closure list, and I want to thank Tim, Megan, and many others in this room for helping mobilize the community and our parents to speak out at the board hearings and other meetings. And so they gave, yes, thank you. I mean, CPS did give other reasons for taking us off the closure list, but I mean, honestly, I'm convinced that it was the community support that was really responsible for that. And though we were taken off the list, we're not closed, obviously, both our teachers and our families really continue to be very, very nervous about the school's future, and that really still continues today. It's part of that cycle, that graphic that Jenny had showed earlier. And so, we've lost about 100 students in the last 6 years, and in the school year 2015 to 16, when those data were made available through a Chicago Tribune article, and thanks to Betsy for sharing that with me, only 42% of our students who live within our attendance boundary that year were actually enrolled at Gale. So and that means the other 58% chose to attend other schools. So a quick look to see who's staying and who's choosing other schools. This slide compares the race and ethnicity breakout for Gale as compared to Rogers Park as a whole. It's not a perfect comparison because obviously our attendance boundary is just a subset of the larger Rogers Park community area. And we're up in the farthest northeast corner of Rogers Park, and our boundary goes from Evanston south to Chase and from Paulina to the lake. So you can see here that while Rogers Park as a whole has a racial and ethnically diverse population, Gale students are predominantly children of color, and this is true for a lot of under-resourced CPS neighborhood schools that are trying to move up from level 2. And so really this becomes a racial equity and a social justice issue. Next slide. Well, despite this, we do have, we obviously have a lot of challenges related to our resources or lack thereof, but we also do have a lot of assets that we're trying to build on. We have visionary leadership in our principal, Augustine Umua, who used to be at the school, and our vice principal, Melinda Jean-Baptiste. We do have a master's level school counselor who is a Gale alumna, so she's from the community, who joined the staff this year. And we have many, many strong community partnerships, a few of which I'm highlighting in some of these photos in these next slides. Here in this photo, we've got Julie Gainey from Lifeline Theater, who's leading a workshop in one of our 3rd grade classrooms. We have our music teacher, Ms. Ruiz, with our students on their way to perform with the Chicago Children's Choir. And we're very excited about the planned reconfiguration of our Millennium Learning Garden. This started over the summer with the installation of the learning area, which is that black and white area on the right-hand side, and that was supported by the kitchen community. And then the redesigned section in color is being made possible by the 49th Ward participatory budgeting funds that we won, thanks to our partners from A Just Harvest and to our remarkable community resource liaison, Carol Melnick. And so we're really trying to build on these strengths. We have a greenhouse that's in our building as well that not everyone knows about. This next one is our photos from our city year Martin Luther King Day of Service this past January, which several of you, I think, were also there, and we really appreciate it. They brought in about 1,200 volunteers, including about 100 from Northwestern University, which has been another strong partner with us. And so here you can see just a few of the many projects that they had to beautify our learning spaces. And we're really grateful to the city year team who spent countless hours planning the work. I mentioned earlier that we do not have a librarian, but I don't have a photo of it here, but one thing that City Year is also helping us with is establishing hallbraries. In other words, bookshelves in the hallways so that the books can continue to be made available to students. And so finally, with this last slide, I want to close by saying we've also started a Friends of the School group called Gale Grows Kids. Many of you already know about this, that we're in the midst of trying to raise funds for a CVS Smart Clinic at Gale. Again, this is a model that also started here at Sullivan, and we're hoping to replicate the great academic achievement outcomes at our school as well. I want to thank everyone who's already contributed, especially to Leo Smith, Heather Staines, and the Staines Family Foundation for their incredible generosity, and to folks like Maria, Natalia, Jim, who have sponsored community fundraisers for us. And so in closing, I do think we're on an upswing at Gale, but it's also a continuing uphill battle. It takes a lot of volunteer time, staff time, and energy to build and maintain these community partnerships in the absence of adequate school funding, and to tie them to our academic goals. And this is especially hard in an under-resourced school in which we don't have the amount of staffing that we would like or need. We just have a limited number of administrators and staff, and parents do a constant juggling act between instruction, social emotional learning, parents and families, and community partners to try to move everything forward in the same direction. And at times it can be very, very difficult. So I hope you'll join me in expressing admiration and appreciation to all of the dedicated teachers and administrators and families out there, not only at Gale, but also at Sullivan and all of our sister public schools in Rogers Park and beyond. So thank you.
We had talked about passing questions up, but we're a fairly small crowd, so I think if you stand and project, we can probably hear your question. I will repeat it on the mic so that it can be recorded. So, why don't you go ahead?
That's a minority who come with evidence-based things. Not really getting support. Are there any other measures to put pressure or a way to kind of make that sting more than actually do it? Kind of like the example for the past week committee that you brought up. More of that there that we can do as a community or to the state. Because I don't know if evidence-based was truly did get
So I think the question, if I'm going to repeat it so that it can be recorded, but correct me if I'm wrong, is that in addition to the evidence-based funding formula as an advocacy tool, what else can we use to push for getting that formula fully funded?
Okay, so I'm the wrong one to ask that question to, because I'm not a community advocate, I'm not an organizer, I'm a policy guy. But I can tell you from my standpoint, this is different from what you're talking about, because every legislator I know of says they are pro-education. Every single one of them. It's kind of like being pro-jobs, right? No one runs for office and says, you elect me and all our jobs are going to Indiana, right? No one says that. What we've never had before as a stakeholder community interested in adequately and equitably funded education was any sort of metric that said, we know you're underfunding schools because of this research. And it changed the discussion. So I want to tell you, when we advocated for the model across the state, and we were with a bunch of other people in a coalition, the initial efforts were around equity. Didn't work. When the framing changed to be, by the way, this is what the research indicates is needed for kids to succeed academically, you're for funding what the research says works, right? How do you say no to that? No, I'm against what the evidence says works to educate children. It changes the discussion, and it creates a lot more heat. So do I think you need to do the same other advocacy stuff you've always done? Yes. But I think this framing will make all your other efforts far more effective, because you can put legislators on the spot with a real simple question. Do you support doing what the evidence says works? We have a school funding model that says, here's what the evidence says is needed. Are you against that? Are you against the evidence? And if the answer to that is no, I'm for what the evidence says, well, then you're for funding it. So I think it changes the discussion. I really do think it's different than these other things that have come up down the road just because of the importance of education and the fact that this is tied to the research. And it did change the debate when we pushed the bill. I mean, literally the only reason this bill might not have been signed into law was Governor Rauner. And when he took credit for it in his campaign ads, you know, those of us that worked on the legislation were a little taken aback. And you mentioned the credit, the tax credit. That's what the governor asked for. So literally, that was the pound of flesh requested by the governor to sign the bill.
It's true. I believe it.
Okay, another question. Go ahead. Can you stand so we can hear better? Thanks.
The TIF surplus more? How is, I don't really know what TIF surplus is and how it's used to fund schools.
Sure, Jenny, do you want to start with that? I think you brought it up on one of your slides.
I will try.
Oh, and I'm sorry, the question was explain the TIF surplus.
TIF stands for tax increment funding. Yay! All right.
It's totally irresponsible financing, but whatever. So it stands for something.
So throughout the city, there are various TIF districts. They are supposed to, help me with the wording here, they're supposed to, economic development. It's supposed to be for blighted communities to get funding to invest back in their own communities. So what happens is, and how I really learned about this was I went to the Chicago Reader and just read a bunch of Ben Joravsky's articles from the past. And I just kind of immersed myself in it and tried to figure out what the heck was going on. And I also, very early on, Raise Your Hand had a TIF forum. That was probably in like 2010 or 2011. I remember going to that. And there's other organizations that do the TIF Illumination Project will come and talk to a community. So there's various ways to find out. But basically what happens is you pay your property taxes, right? If you live in a TIF district, when your area becomes a TIF district, your tax dollars are capped. Am I saying that correctly? No. How about if he explains that?
So I testified at the TIF Reform Task Force this morning in Springfield. So here's how a TIF works. Municipality has its EAV, right? This is your municipality. They say this area here is blighted. We declare it a TIF district. From that date forward, the growth in the value of that EAV is not taxable by all the taxing authorities, the school, the municipality, et cetera. All that growth goes to fund the development of the community. They basically get to take the levies of every other taxing authority. So your school levy, your municipality levy, your park district levy, whatever, they add those together, come up with a percentage. That's the TIF increment finance percentage. And they apply that against the growth in value in this community, in this area, and all that money goes to fund the economic development project, which is supposed to be the subject of a detailed agreement. TIF lasts for 23 years. So if you think about that, freezing the value at what it was 23 years ago for all the other taxing authorities takes a significant amount of potential growth off the books that the other taxing authorities can't reach. And then at the end of 23 years, unless they get approval from the other taxing authorities to extend it for 10, I think, unless they get that approval, any surplus money remaining in the TIF has to be redistributed back to the other taxing authorities pro rata. So usually the school levy is about 62%, the municipality level's roughly 15%, park district about, and all the others about another 25%. So whatever the money is, it gets split out that way. That's how it's supposed to work. There are problems. So they modified the TIF law to allow surpluses to be moved from one TIF to a contiguous TIF. Every TIF in Chicago is now technically under the law contiguous to every other TIF. So the surplus from one area can be moved and moved and moved and moved. There's no reporting requirements around this portability of the surplus. So it just basically becomes revenue that should have gone to other taxing authorities that can now be used for whatever economic development other TIF areas want to do. It's not really a very accountable way to go about it. There's roughly $850 million in surplus right now in Chicago TIFs, I think, something like that. Well, but some of it's been dedicated. I mean, this is true surplus. I mean, they've dedicated some of that revenue. So once it's dedicated to a contract or a development thing, it comes out of the technical surplus. So it's more like 850, 900 million now. Close to call it $1 billion if you want. It's getting there. Yeah. But that's a lot of money that technically should have been distributed back to the taxing authorities pro rata. It's a one-time bump, but then there's that ongoing growth in the EAV.
So like right now, if the mayor were to declare a complete TIF surplus and we're going to give the money back to the taxing bodies, we would, I believe CPS would get 53% of that $850 million. So when we push for TIF surplus, we're pushing for, hey, you've got this surplus money that's basically kind of in the slush fund, and why don't you give some of it back to the taxing bodies? And it's not just, it does not have to go just to CPS. It goes to the parks and the fire department, et cetera, et cetera. And did I answer your question? Yeah, it's a short-term like infusion of money, but it's also good to know how they work and don't work, because it's kind of a sneaky way to take money from the public good. And there's also lots of TIF districts that shouldn't be TIF districts. They're not blighted, and that's Michigan Avenue is a TIF district.
Chris.
Real blighted community right there.
My question is, how did we get stuck with the student with the SBB? My question too, I guess. And I believe I heard that it was pushed by ALEC or by the Koch brothers or some other group, but what's the history of that? Is there any hope of anything there?
So the question is, how did we get stuck with the student-based budgeting formula, and who was behind it, and how can we get rid of it?
Well, other states have districts that have some student-based funding. Is CPS the only one that does it in Illinois?
So I went back last night and looked at a bunch of budget books from CPS so I could try to understand, because I knew student-based budgeting would come up, because student-based budgeting is a huge concern and something we really need to look at more closely and possibly start advocating against. And I found it started in 2014. Wendy, I'm sorry, I'm going to call you out of the audience. Didn't Brizard bring it here? It was when Brizard was here, and that was the unfunded longer day situation. He was talking about student-based budgeting, and I think it was him who actually piloted it at a few schools. And when they piloted it, the student-based budgeting amount was in the $6,000 range. But when they started it in fiscal year 14, the base rate was $4,140.03. So right away, like, people were concerned, like, student-based budgeting, this doesn't sound like a really good idea. And then when there was this huge difference between the pilot, supposedly the pilot people were happy with it. And I don't know, maybe $6,000, you would get a lot more bang for your buck on that one. That's $2,000 more a student. So maybe it was like a good amount, or maybe, the people were just saying it was great, or maybe it was CPS just telling us the people said it was great. Could be any of the above. And and I think Brizard may have had a program when he left New York, and then shortly after that started, he was gone. And I think it was Barbara Bird Bennett that maybe implemented it in this fiscal year. I'm sorry, all of this is it starts coming into your brain, and it just kind of all starts flowing together. I was trying to make sense of it myself last night. So it started, just so if you want to know, it started at $4,140, like I said. Fiscal year 15, they actually raised it by $250. They made a big deal about it in their budget book, if you want to go see it. And that one was definitely signed by Barbara Bird Bennett. And then in fiscal year 16, I think they kept it the same. And then when in fiscal year 17 they did a mid-year cut, it went down to $40.87. And then it stayed that way the next year, and I think it's exactly the same. Actually, they say now it's $42.90, but that's because of the cost of living salary increases. That was the reason why they gave for that. I think there was something maybe within the contract, or they figured out the math that, we have this student-based budgeting, and schools have figured out, and maybe Joanna could speak to this as an LSC member, it puts the onus on schools on how they make the decisions, but some of those decisions are now based on, if you go to hire a teacher, if you have a teacher with 5 years experience versus someone that's coming in as a first year, or even like a 10-year experienced teacher, I mean, that's gonna be a solid teacher. What are you going to decide given your budget limits? You're probably going to take the first year teacher, and you know what? The first year teacher might be great and awesome, but those are the types of decisions that are really having to be made that can impact things long-term at a school.
David.
One of my favorite slides was the raise your hand slide that has a messaging for the, call there and say that. So one of the challenges I have is, there's all these messages.
Yeah.
Can we come up with some tight messages? Like, for instance, Ralph, you mentioned, in terms of the funding formula and pressing politicians and holding them accountable to funding the school adequately. Can we commit to coming up with effective messaging and then work on identifying specific campaigns? Like, for instance, it's not okay with me that local schools don't have librarians or computer labs that are staffed with teachers who can help support the teachers and students to use them. That's an example. So, something as simple as that. Did you know that the school is no librarian? I think that's a fundamental thing. But do you guys have any thoughts about potentially working on messaging or ideas for messaging?
So the question is about unifying some messaging and targeting it very specifically at different decision makers, correct? And what are your recommendations for that?
That's an excellent question. it's complex because there's so many different issues, so many different messages we have, but I see what you're saying. Like, there's something very clear here that we need 7.4, is that right? $7.4 billion to really fund this. I think right there's potentially a clear message. Ralph recommends over 5 years. Maybe that doesn't seem reasonable to a decision maker, but maybe it's a reasonable ask for us to be consistently saying we need $7.4 billion over 5 years. I do see your other point, though, that around, like, for example, librarians, like just getting that information to a decision maker can be huge, because that could, well, that's true, even your next door neighbor. You're right. Yes, yes. Well, there's different organizations also working on different campaigns. There is a librarian organization. Is that you, Megan?
No comment.
Or do you know of that?
I've heard of them, yes.
Every librarians count. There's different organizations that are targeting different things, is one way of looking at it. We do have community-based organizations working together. We try to get messaging out. I think just really talking to your neighbors, attending a local school council meeting to even get the information, because it's hard even for us as an organization to get all the information. We just hear randomly from people here and there, and then it kind of alerts us to, oh, there must be a problem in this area. And I think talking to your neighbors, if a school has an open house or some type of community event, going into that and getting the information. I think first it's like we have to get the information, and then working with organizations like Raise Your Hand, or if you have a particular education issue, we do a lot of funding, but maybe even finding like a librarian to work with, and to help. And we always need people helping us with our messaging and how to get that out. Wendy, did you want to add something? Revenue Messaging Committee. We just formed it here tonight, Chicago.
So we are short on time. I want to take a minute to thank again our panelists, Ralph Martire, Jenny Biggs, and Joanna Sue, for their time. I also want to leave you with a few thoughts. One is that despite the daunting topic of school funding, I think there was a lot of hope in tonight's conversation. There's a lot of possibility, and there are also some specific things we can do right away. You'll see some of those on the board. We at Network 49 are very pleased to be hosting another event with Raise Your Hand in a couple of weeks, and that is a screening of the film Backpack Full of Cash, a film that focuses on the impact of charter schools and how they've impacted funding for public education. That's going to be at the 400 Theater. You can pick up a flyer on your way out. We hope to see you there. And I hear there's going to be pizza at the screening as well. So please join us for that. Also, if you want to talk to anybody about Network 49 and what we're doing to continue this conversation in Rogers Park, please see someone at the front table. And we will have a general membership meeting for Network 49 on March 21st. We normally meet at a park, but since it is the day after the primary, we will be meeting at the Heartland Bar, and that's at 7 p.m. And please do not forget that the deadline for LSC applications is this Friday at your local school at 3 p.m. There's information about the LSC elections on your way out too. Please pick up a flyer, and don't forget to vote in the primary election, which is March 20th, but early voting starts at the neighborhood locations this weekend. So please take some of the things you learned and put those ideas into action at the voting box. Thanks for coming. Have a great evening.